Getting to be the end of the day, and we have a wonderful speaker here to give us the last talk for this afternoon's conference. So I'd like to introduce Emily Riddle, who is a nehiyaw Plains Cree writer, researcher, and policy analyst from Treaty 6. Welcome home, Emily. Who currently lives in Vancouver on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. She has worked with First Nations and Métis communities on diverse policy development, governance projects, and community campaigns. Emily is on the boards for the Yellowhead Institute and We Press, a downtown East Side community art space. She has written for Teen Vogue, the Globe and Mail, and Canadian Art. And in fact, I pulled one of her articles from the Globe and Mail, an article she wrote in July of 2018 called Cutting Greyhound Service in Western Canada Puts Indigenous Women at Risk, something many of us, I think, are feeling sad about for sure. So we're very pleased to have Emily here to speak to us today about treaty feminism. She's going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to questions.
Thanks, Pat, for the introduction. So, Mio Gisigao, Niasiga Soon, Emily Riddle, Nia Oma Nehiyaw, Otsainia Kaputagao, Egwa Amaskwachi Waskaigan. I'm really excited to be home. It feels very different to speak at home. I want to acknowledge that we're on the territories of the Nehiyaw, my people, the Nakota, the Saulteaux, the Plains and Anishinaabe, which are often forgotten in this place, and the Métis. So I also want to acknowledge the Papachaise, whose reserve should be on this land this campus occupies. In doing this, however, this is a controversial thing, I want everyone to know that the reserve era is a very small time very small in the overall time of this place. I also want to acknowledge the presence of the Garneau family, whose river lot was very close to here, and their relationship with Chief Papasteo as an example of a Codowan as kinship. So in many ways, I was raised on this campus. I did my undergraduate degree here, a poli-sci degree with a certificate in Aboriginal Governance and Partnership, which is a program I recommend. And my dad has worked here for over 30 years. And while I maintain that the academy is still an explicitly white supremacist space that privileges Western knowledge, I've had very many good experiences here, particularly because of many Indigenous mentors. I want to also acknowledge the work of Gail, who's done a lot of organization and running around today. I'm looking at my mom right now, whose name is also Gail. But Gail with the Parkland Institute, who's put everything together for today. So we could get, hopefully. I have lots of acknowledgements, and I also want to acknowledge all the people that keep this building clean because they're often invisibilized. That's a good clap too. And I want to acknowledge the Indigenous students who still face explicit racism in this space, even though many are on their homelands. And I want to acknowledge the Indigenous people who are often removed by campus security, despite this being a public university, despite this being Indigenous land. So where we are, across the river, the North Saskatchewan Kitsawane-Sipi, which flows from the rapidly shrinking ice fields in the Rocky Mountains all the way to the Hudson's Bay. To the north, where we are right now, Métis scholar Michelle Murphy writes, "The water is not still. It is indifferent to borders, cycling through the atmosphere, splashing off office towers, and returning to nourish humans, animals, and plants." On the other side of the river, close to where the Alberta legislature now stands, and yes, I'll have some words about Jason Kenney later. I've had some chats about that today. My band, Alexander, entered Treaty 6, and I say entered because when you say signed treaty, you're privileging the written agreement rather than the oral history of what the agreement actually is. We entered Treaty 6 on August 21st, 1877 with the British Crown, not with Canada. Treaty 6 was negotiated in the summer prior at Fort Carleton and Fort Pitt in what's now known as Saskatchewan. There is no marker that depicts this adherence to treaty, which is not surprising because the existence of Alberta and the legislature itself is anti-treaty. To the south of where we are now, not far from here, is McKernan, where I grew up, a neighborhood named after a white settler by the name of John McKernan, who bought a large plot of land for $250 in 1878, the year after we adhered to treaty. For this very low price, John McKernan acquired McKernan Lake, which was connected to Lendrum Lake, if you know where Sunterra and the Lendrum neighborhood is, right about there, by a waterway that was large enough for a canoe, which is a very different geography to imagine today. My grandfather on my dad's side used to take the streetcar across the high-level bridge to skate on McKernan Lake, which was drained in 1948. So I do not know the nehiyaw, the Cree names for these lakes, but I do know this was a popular camping place, most recently for the Papa's Chase. I'm not the first Cree to grow up on the shores of this lake, and the flooding that occurs in Park Allen in the summer downpours is a reminder that we only have so much power over the land, even in urban spaces. Dwayne Trevor McDonald, who's an education professor here at the U of A, writes, "The stories that Aboriginal people tell of Edmonton were forgotten when the city started to grow and modernize." But he argues that a core symptom of colonialism is the erasure of shared narratives between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. It is through this process that in the minds of settlers, Edmonton became effectively settled, a place where Indigenous bodies no longer belong, even with a faint remembrance of pre-colonial past or a few bridges named in nehiyaw. To the west, quite far over the Rocky Mountains is where I now live, on the territories, as Pat said, of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. I've lived on these territories that are not my own for 3 years to go to school, and now I work for the First Nations Education Steering Committee on First Nations education policy and advocacy. So FNESC, the short name, it's a very long name, has recently completed a new tripartite sectoral self-governance agreement for First Nations K-12 education and represents all the First Nations in BC, which is over 100, so it's quite a lot of moving pieces. It's a very interesting existence to live on the end of the proposed pipelines coming from territories that is to be the source of them. My First Nation, along with most in the area, have agreements with Kinder Morgan. As I'm sure you know, at the end of August, Tsleil-Waututh won a challenge that was supposed to halt the construction of Kinder Morgan. It's no longer called this, but because Kinder Morgan has sold the pipeline to the federal government, as I'm sure everyone in the room knows, but we need to come up with a better name. I was in a room with a bunch of lawyers last weekend. They suggested Taxpayer Mountain, but I'm not totally sold on that one either, so. Last weekend, I heard a Tsleil-Waututh youth, Cedar George, talk about how his nation has been meticulously mapping their territory and resources and how this is one of the major reasons they won this court case. They could prove that Canada did not adequately consult them. They could prove how they use all of their territory and why. However, this pipeline, despite this court case decision, continues to be built under the guise of maintenance on the original. We know this from people that live in the interior of BC. So although I'm fairly anti-pipeline, I guess I've been on the West Coast for a fair amount of time. No, it was before there, I moved there. When I see white activism in the city regarding pipelines, I wonder who from our communities and who from this land has given you the direction to do so. White environmentalists so often use our title, and yes, in Treaty 6 we still have title, to further their projects, abandoning Native communities and bodies once they have achieved their goals. So often I see posts on social media about how the only way to save this planet and its inhabitants, or us, I suppose, I think other life forms will live on, is to return the land to Indigenous peoples or to return to Indigenous systems. While I wholeheartedly believe this is true, I resist the commodification of our knowledge, and I wonder, do we owe you saving? To the east, is where I was last week on the territories of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee at a workshop in Toronto about Indigenous land and water defense, which is where I heard Cedar Parker talk, with folks from all around the country who are land defenders, academics, and lawyers. So this is an event hosted by the Yellowhead Institute, which Pat mentioned I am a board member. And we talked about the forces that alienate ourselves from our territories, which is very different as someone who lives away from my territory. So those thoughts are with me today, and the violence of urbanism is something I will reflect and continue to reflect on this talk. So I was asked, the reason I was invited, I think, is as a representative of the Yellowhead Institute, so I will have to give my little plug now, my little talk. So the Yellowhead Institute is the first Indigenous think tank in Canada. It's based out of Ryerson. I'm lucky to be the youngest, but not the scrappiest board member, I would certainly say. There's a lot more controversial board members on Twitter than me. But it is important to have an Indigenous think tank to comment on policy because for so long we've had to digest reports from conservative, non-native academics with little community experience. This is a direct, in-person subtweet of the Fraser Institute. And those who live with the ramification of policy changes are in the best position to comment. We have many brilliant people in our communities, and brilliant in many different ways in which institutions like the one we're in right now do not honor. The Yellowhead Institute, which opened officially in June, has 5 objectives. So number 1, shaping new governance models and supporting governance work in First Nations and urban communities. Number 2, influencing policy development and holding governments accountable for policies affecting First Nations. This is something that was done in the first report that came out in the spring, the first white paper, which critiqued Trudeau's Indigenous rights recognition. What is this official title? Indigenous Rights and Recognition Framework, which has since been stalled, and we'll see what happens after the election. Number 3, contributing to public education on the legal and political relationship between First Nations and Canada. Number 4, facilitating opportunities for and supporting Indigenous students and researchers. And number 5, building solidarity with non-Indigenous students and researchers. So I really recommend that you go to the Yellowhead website because we're slowly building up a library of policy briefs and reports. And we have 15 research fellows, including Matt Wildcat and Shailene Jobin, who are both professors at this university. Shailene and I are currently writing the winter report, which is what I'll be working on after this weekend, about the First Nations Land Management Act, which is based on some research that we previously did when I was a student here. And this report is really a culmination of knowledge from the work that we've done with communities across Western Canada and our research. So what is treaty feminism? In nehiyaw scholar Gina Starblankett's dissertation, Beyond Rights and Wrongs Towards a Treaty-Based Practice of Relationality, she writes that historic treaties and their implementation should not be viewed as a means of incorporation into the state, but as a refusal to be included at all. This is how we maintain our nehiyaw in our jurisdiction and our own worldview separate from settlers. This is why it is a problem when you conflate reconciliation with treaty, because treaty unreconciles us. And implementing treaty would look entirely counter to what this reconciliation model looks like in this country. As someone who's lived in British Columbia, BC, other than a portion in the northeast, which is Treaty 8, is entirely, and a little bit of the island of the Douglas Treaties, has no historic treaties, which is what people in BC call unceded. However, I really think this unceded/ceded binary gets us into trouble sometimes because though it is undeniable that nations in BC continue to hold title to their land, here in Treaty 6 we do too. Treaty 6, despite whatever the written text says, grants settlers the right to live here and to use the land up to the depth of a plow. But allowing you to live here does not mean foregoing title. Returning to Gina's scholarship, she brilliantly proves that treaty making is a radical act, brilliant act of diplomacy. So if you've just studied anything about the negotiation of Treaty 6, you know that Nehiyaw hired our own translator because we didn't trust that the commissioner would send someone that spoke the right dialect, and they did indeed send someone that spoke Swampy Cree and not Plains Cree. And that the Crown Commissioner, Alexander Morris, was let go, and another was hired for Treaty 7 because he had supposedly conceded too much. Nehiyaw legal scholar Janice Makokas, who's also a board member for Yellowhead with me, writes of Treaty 6, it was understood that Indigenous peoples would always be able to practice and exercise our laws, way of life, and customs with no intrusion from the Crown governments. Of course, we note at the same time that Treaty 6 was being made, policies regarding Indians were being consolidated into the Indian Act, which was introduced and implemented in 1876. Of course, the Indian Act sought and continues to seek to masculinize our governance systems, to do away with queer and transness. Nehiyaw lawyer, and I feel like I'm just going to shout out like a lot of Cree women throughout this talk continually, but it will keep happening. Nehiyaw lawyer and scholar Sylvia McAdam writes, this is a longer quote, "The law keepers are the Nehiyaw women, but with the advent of the Indian Act, the status of women and the legalizing of Nehiyaw ceremonies had a terrible consequence on parenting and the transferring of Indigenous knowledge. To me, a treaty feminist ethic is the commitment to learn and live more about the treaty that I have within my own body, the treaty that we have with settlers through Treaty 6, and the treaty relationships we have with other Indigenous nations. It means I sincerely believe that in order for us to achieve the repatriation of our land, And to bring forward our concerns with treaty, we need to involve all our citizens, including anyone who fits into one or more of these categories: women, two-spirit, queer, transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming. It means that I sincerely believe that the exclusion of these citizens from our governance and from decision-making means we are far from the intentions of our ancestors, who had negotiated or adhered to Treaty 6, in which men were given permission to enter by women. It means the exclusion of these citizens from communities and ceremonies means that we have a distorted masculine heteropatriarchal understanding of Creeness, and that we need to consistently challenge, even if it means challenging what is deemed traditional. Leanne Simpson, who's an Anishinaabe thinker and scholar and artist, describes this type of world destruction that occurs when queer youth are denied space in our communities. This is a quote: "The toll of crushing on bodies, minds, spirits is accumulative, diminishing, and restrictive." And in Treaty 6, we are dealing with this cumulative destruction and consequent distortion of our governance practices. Through the work of recovering what our nation's intellectual traditions and philosophies have to say about gender and sexuality, I see expansive, caring, queer nehiyaw worlds emerging that reflect our governance and cultural orders, even if they are not explicitly about that. So I mean to say that the artists like Billy Ray Belcourt, who are writing poetry books, are actually talking about governance, even if they're not explicitly talking about governance. I do not think that it is a detriment of our thought, and I think it is a burden unfairly held by queer Indigenous peoples to overtly accept what is deemed traditional in order to be accepted into heterosexual ceremonies, academic, or artistic spaces. Of course, this expansive, caring world built by women and two-spirit people is not new, and the migration to cities from reserves in the 1950s and 60s signified a major shift towards alternative forms of governance and community in reaction to the specific political experiment of reserves. Unlike major Canadian cities, such as Toronto or Vancouver that I live in, the majority of Indigenous people in prairie cities are living in their homelands, and therefore enacting a particular type of urban territorial governance that I think is often erased. So in policy, which is the world that I occupy, the increasing power and voice of urban Indigenous populations is seen as a threat to the sovereignty of First Nations bands. The federal government continually attempts to undermine First Nations by allocating funding to organizations such as friendship centers, who have and continue to do important political and cultural work, but do not represent treaty descendants. Most nehiyaw I know who live in prairie cities will ultimately locate themselves as members of First Nations, even if they have lived in cities for their entire lives. And rethinking how we conceptualize urban governance, I think we need to think about First Nations staking claim to the rightful territories in urban centers and delivering services there, rather than seeing urban populations as a threat to the sovereignty of First Nation bands. Our homelands extend beyond reserves. Feeling like we do not belong beyond the reserve in Treaty 6 is a particular kind of violence done to our bodies because it disconnects us from stories and places in our territories. Definitely there are places in Edmonton that are significant and sacred, and from the seasonal movement that is fundamental in nehiyaw governance. And it also does not properly reflect the intended Treaty 6 relationship. So the late Art Manual of the Squamish Nation, who you should read his 2 books if you haven't, he passed away last year, stated that when you add up all the Indian reserves in Canada, the land we got is 0.2%, and we're expected to make a living off of that. So my friend Lindsay Nixon recently published a memoir, which is one of the books that I feel like has made me feel the most seen as a prairie person. And I want to read this long quote, which relates back to what I deem as treaty feminism, which I think might make them mad because they're very anti-treaty explicitly in some of their posts, but this is the quote. So this is a prayer for all you crazy bitches, all you Esquoiac who came from a crazy Esquoio, who is a descendant of a long line of crazy Esquoiac, from all those dirt-poor areas around Prince Albert, Saskatoon, Regina, and the Battlefords. Crazy Esquoiac are just femme Indians with sharp tongues and a quick wit who are tough as nails and don't take flack, just like you learned in the spirit of your people. This is a queer prairie femme ethic. Conversely, we have seen and lived with the manifestations of settler feminist ethic, White men, the fathers of Canada, are the villains we target in revising the false Canadian history we've been fed for hundreds of years. However, disempowered by the patriarchy of their own culture, white women were and continue to be active participants in settler colonial nation building. In 1928 until 1972, the Sexual Sterilization Act was active in Canada with the support of many members of the Famous Five, who we still celebrate in the city with all their parks. This act enabled the Alberta Eugenics Board to involuntarily sterilize people that were deemed mentally unfit, nearly 3,000 people. Indigenous women were a large portion of these sterilizations, and as someone with an Indigenous mother and a father with epilepsy, it's difficult to reconcile this chapter in Alberta's history with the depicted legacy of these women. So this week, I'm sure some people are aware, a truth that Indigenous women have been aware of for a long time, that since 1972, we've continued to be coercively sterilized. At least 60 women are pursuing a class action lawsuit for forced sterilizations over the past 20 to 25 years in Saskatchewan, and there have been reports of this practice all over Western provinces. So white feminist movements have often come at the expense of Indigenous women's liberties. Rather than gifting us rights, as some white feminists will have you believe, autonomy over our bodies is not granted through settler laws, but through creation. And I'm obviously not rejecting feminism, given the title of my talk, because as many Native women do, which I can respect, as nehiyaw legal scholar Tracy Lindbergh writes of using the term feminism in much the same way that the socialists were first in line to interpret capitalism and its effects on Indigenous economies and nations, the tool has proven useful. Some Cree men want us to believe that adopting tools like guns is very useful, more valuable and culturally relevant than adopting tools like feminism, which I'd argue also very useful. So where we are going. As someone who no longer lives in Alberta, but whose territory is implicated in the 2019 provincial election, which we've been thinking a lot about today, I've keenly watched the actions of this government unfold and will keenly watch the results of the election in the spring. I think it is important to recognize that providing a treaty report card, as I was to do for this paper, on the current provincial government is somewhat inconsequential because the province is not a partner in treaty. We will still be here when Alberta no longer exists. Our treaty is not with Alberta, not even with Canada. The provincial borders artificially separate nehiyaw, artificially separate our treaty territory. It's actually initially proposed that all the western provinces be called a very large province called Buffalo, so I wonder how different things would look if that were true. But provincial policy has no doubt an effect on our ability to assert and live out our rights in our homelands on many fronts, particularly as First Nations people are increasingly urbanized, not living on reserves. However, treaties so often tokenly acknowledged, or the components regarding service delivery are merely discussed. So service delivery, I work in service delivery in education, is integral and continues to be chronically underfunded, as demonstrated by, for example, like the very minimal coverage for the non-insured health benefits program, or the fact that it took from 1997 to 2017 for the federal government to remove the cap on post-secondary spending for First Nations students. So while these services are integral to our well-being, and our ancestors were rather brilliant in guaranteeing them to us. No one was, like in the late 1800s, we were guaranteed universal education and healthcare by ancestors, which is not a spot that many other people were at. I ask, what does it mean to acknowledge treaty at meetings or in organizations that are actively dispossessing us of our lands? What does it mean when you make treaty about friendship and not about territory? So in a Facebook post regarding her attendance, Rachel Notley's attendance at the Edmonton City Hall Treaty 6 Recognition Day, she wrote, "On Treaty 6 Recognition Day, it is important to take time to reflect and recognize our connection to the Indigenous people of this land. All Albertans are treaty people. There is so much more we need to do together, and so much further we need to go, especially as it relates to honoring the spirit of the treaties and making sure Indigenous peoples take their rightful place in Alberta and Canada as full partners, leaders, and colleagues." Sounds good, right? A comment underneath read, "Indigenous people have been, are, and will be Canadian pride. United, the Canada will prosper." The point of treaty, to return to Gina's star blanket, is that we are separate and distinct from Canadians, not a point of pride. Another comment read, "Not to be rude, but aren't they given every opportunity to excel with the benefits that taxpayers provide?" As Métis PhD student Smalley Swain, who's studying at this university, recently tweeted, "Anyone trying to assert their authority or legitimacy by describing themselves as a taxpayer automatically loses authority, legitimacy, and my interest." In Rachel Notley's 2016 directive to her ministers, she wrote of implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which has been this sort of mad rush from all these premiers in all over Canada, although probably not in Ontario anymore, to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And she wrote, "The most challenging part of the discussion will be related to lands and resources." No way. "I believe there's a balance to be found here, working in partnership with Indigenous people so they are able to participate in a more meaningful way, and therefore to benefit from the development of natural resources in the province and the preservation and conservation of the environment." So to me, this is a really disheartening statement to read for a few reasons. Number one, partnership when you have no jurisdiction. Is that really a partnership? A more meaningful way? That seems like rather weak wording. We're not looking to just work together in a more meaningful way because treaty means the resources below the depth of a plow are still under our jurisdiction. We're not partners. In 1930, as many of the folks here know, the federal government transferred jurisdiction over natural resources and crown lands, minus national parks and Indian reserves, to the western provinces. This move demonstrated that the Crown never intended to uphold treaty because it was done without our consent, merely 15 years after. In 2015, the Globe and Mail published an article by Hayden King, who's the executive director at the Yellowhead Institute. In his territory, he's from the Bois-Soleil First Nation, so his territory includes the massive settlement of Toronto, and he asked, "We can imagine escape from the current treaty approach with a renewed embrace of political economies. What would the dish with one spoon look like today?" Which is a name for Southern Ontario. So this is his political suggestion. This is a quote. "Regarding the case of the Confederation-era treaties, reserve borders should be blended with provincial or federal crown lands. In these enlarged areas of Indigenous jurisdiction, the appropriate Blackfoot, Muskego, or whatever nations can manage these lands. Where there would be overlap in traditional territories, principles of Indigenous diplomacy would be invoked to share responsibility. Provincial, territorial, and federal authority would not disappear. These governments would continue to manage plans and administration. Though mining, forestry, and hunting might take place, land use generally could conform to principles that respect Indigenous community desires and the rights of the land as was originally intended." So I promised that I would circle back to Jason Kenney, but I don't really want to give him that much attention. But I want to remind people that Jason Kenney was an MP for the Harper government during the Idle No More era, which supported large omnibus bills that removed protections for waterways and lowered the thresholds for First Nations land surrenders. So though Kenney is largely silent on First Nations policy issues, I've really dug to try and find dirt about what he says about First Nations people and not found that much. I want to... Last month in the media, he touted a proposed legal fund for pro-pipeline First Nations. And I want to remind you that political assembly and organization was illegal until the 1950s in the Indian Act, and for us to hire legal help. So at a speech in the Energy Relaunch Conference in Calgary in Treaty 7, as part of his party's multi-pronged fight-back strategy, this is what he says, against anyone shutting down Alberta's energy sector, he offered to provide legal funding for First Nations to challenge anti-pipeline stance. So in his speech, Kenney said that Indigenous people in favor of natural resource development are often at a disadvantage in comparison with those working with well-funded environmental groups. Yeah. This year, in a statement on National Aboriginal Day, so this is like the little bit of dirt on Kenney that I found, he said, "As leader of the United Conservative Party, I encourage all Albertans to use this day as an opportunity to learn about the contributions of Indigenous peoples to Alberta's cultural and social fabric." So all the resources that make this province prosperous, that pay for this university, that pay for the salaries from many of the people, probably most of the people in this room, are derived from resource extraction from Indigenous lands that's counter to treaty. So where we should go. Well, I support a community of criticism. I've learned in policy spaces that this only goes so far, and that we should focus our energies on imagining a new future, making suggestions on what we should change. Many people can do this. It's not just policy people, it's poets, visual artists, stay-at-home parents, etc. As Alberta faces an election with two major candidates, neither of whom have a solid track record of respecting treaty rights, neither of whom I have a lot of faith in, although I'm sure you know that I'm speaking at this conference, I have a preference. Here are the things I would deem as harm reduction that people should pay mind to. I have 8 questions. How is Alberta working towards lessening the number of Indigenous children and youth in care in this province? How are youth supported in transitioning out of care? How is Alberta planning for climate disaster and economic transition when oil extraction is no longer viable? How is Alberta moving forward with policy and healthcare for people suffering from addiction from the opioid crisis? As someone who does some work in the downtown east side, something I see, it's not as severe here, but it's definitely a major problem. How are public post-secondary institutions like this one held accountable to partnerships with Indigenous communities and to Indigenous student success? That's something that I work on at my job in BC, not here. How is the province supporting trans and gender diverse people? I ask this because they're the most vulnerable people in our communities. A few days ago, BC announced that they're going to have 7 sites for gender-confirming surgeries. They're the first province in Canada to do this, so people no longer have to go to Montreal. This is something that we should be pressing for Alberta. 6, how are queer kids being protected in schools and everywhere? This is something my friend Matt Ward does a lot of work on at Homeward Trust with people who are houseless. A good portion of the houseless youth in Alberta are queer. And Jason Kenney is actively, another Jason Kenney, defending homophobic policies in schools. There's a sound clip that came out recently from about 2005 where Jason Kenney is supporting Stockwell Day that talks about him supporting traditional family values, not supporting gay adoption, being supportive of Alberta using the notwithstanding clause on gay marriage, and he said that he's changed his mind, but his policies clearly demonstrate this is not true. So this week, or actually today, I believe, might have been yesterday, the PC party in Ontario passed Resolution R4, a resolution that says gender identity is not real, and the PC government will remove the teachings and promotion of gender identity from schools and its curriculum. I wonder if the UCP is elected if they would do something similar. So number 7, how is the province committing to creating more Indigenous language speakers? Our languages, so in BC, there are 30 different language groups. I think in Alberta, I want to say we have 6 or 7. I come from the most populous one in the province. But our language is in a lot better shape than many languages in BC. For example, Squamish only has, I think, 4 or 5 speakers. I had someone pass away a few weeks ago. So it's less dire, but also very important. Alberta committed $4 million over 2 years that will go to First Nations colleges and universities that have a primary goal of training early childhood educators in Indigenous language. If Jason Kenney becomes premier, this will be gutted along with efforts to teach Indigenous context in the K-12, like in Ontario. This is my last question. In a province as wealthy as Alberta, what is the province doing to eliminate child poverty? In this very wealthy province, 20 to 25% of children live under the poverty line. Many are First Nations and Métis who are living in their homelands. I ask these questions rather than specific questions about implementing the UN Declaration or honoring treaty because I do not believe those would directly be election issues. But these are all things, whether or not they seem explicitly about Indigenous sovereignty, that are important. The current government has demonstrated that it will contort the messages of both the UN Declaration and Treaty to fit their agenda, and I have much less faith in the UCP, who will not hide their desire for development of Indigenous lands behind increased funding for service delivery, as the Notley government has done. I do not believe that electoral politics will move us much closer to being able to assert jurisdiction over our territories or living out treaty. This is why it's not often a focus of mine. But provincial policy does mean life and death for our people, and we need everyone here. Isabel Tomoreno Jimenez actually shared that in a seminar I took at U of A, that policy is life and death. So I always keep that in mind when I'm writing policy, that's true for some people. For those of you who are learning more about the economic and social implications of treaty implementation, I challenge to ask how you are moving towards challenging jurisdiction on this territory and the alienation of First Nations and Métis people from their land beyond elections. Treaty should make settlers feel as though they have a place here. I wouldn't argue against that, but only upon meeting the conditions we've mutually decided on. Despite intergenerational disruptions, having our children stolen in residential schools, the 60s scoop and the millennial scoop, which is ongoing, we have continued to pass down teachings regarding treaty. Settlers need to begin to develop their own intellectual tradition of doing so. We have a guideline about how to live together. As our populations on the prairies recover, I don't say rise, because we used to be 100% of the population, and the effects of climate change become more real, I do believe there will be a reckoning. Sylvia McAdam wrote in her book, Nationhood Interrupted, Revitalizing Nehiyaw Legal Systems, this is a quote, "Before any reconciliation can begin, the settlers need to understand that part of the justice is to give it back, which is not to say to leave the lands. Give it back means to restore the livelihood, demonstrate respect for what is shared, the land, by making things right through compensation, restoration, and freedom, dignity, and livelihood. This is to say that while nehiyaw are implicated in the 2019 election, and we will pay keen attention, even when we live on the coast, Indigenous politics is not truncated into electoral terms, but rather plans for us to remain here in perpetuity. XA. Thank you. I think Pat's gonna moderate the questions, but I had a few notes that I wanted to make about the Q&A. So I really wanted to leave lots of time for questions. I would really like to prioritize questions from people who are of this territory, Indigenous people, and also queer and trans folks. And please ask me something that's roughly related to my paper, because sometimes I feel like I get used as a native sounding board about any topic. So let's keep it related to the paper somewhat. Thank you.
All right, so there is, I believe, a roving mic. And there are two of them. And so if you just put up your hands if you have a question, and we would ask that you please keep your comments to questions to the extent possible, as opposed to, other commentary, so that the more people can have an opportunity to ask questions if possible. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. You mentioned Kenny's pro-pipeline Native initiative. Mm-hmm. What do you think about Calvin Libben's that dance with dependency? And he wrote that in 2006. In 2007, they had the Olympic United Way Leaders Recognition event, October 17th, 2007, and I bought the book, a used book, and you open it, and the dedication is by sponsors, Fraser, Milner, Casgrain, Enbridge. Mm-hmm. So we didn't hear about Calvin Helen until this year. Mm-hmm. So who's been working with Calvin Helen since who knows when?
I don't know exactly who's partnered with Calvin Helen. He's quite a figure in BC First Nations politics. He's not in leadership anymore in the Shimsham community, which is, I believe, Metlakatla or somewhere around there. So what do I think of Calvin Helen? So he's quoted in a lot of articles about Jason Kenney's pro-pipeline funding, and he thinks that environmentalists are unnecessarily meddling in First Nations politics, which to an extent I would agree with. Maybe the only thing that I agree with Calvin Helen on. Yeah, I mean, that community is very interesting because there's a definite distinction between their traditional governance with their chiefs and the Indian Act governance, and depending on what stance either of them have is who industry approaches, which happens a lot in BC. So we have corporations from China approaching the traditional chiefs rather than the Indian Act chiefs because they believe them to have more authority in the community.
I'm just wondering, actually, Emily, because you gave us a number of suggestions, mm-hmm. And can you be, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm curious to know, you talked about treaty feminism and the fact that, you know, the patriarchal nature of the Indian Act, et cetera, has taken the fundamental feminist, if I can call it that, or matriarchal approach that Indigenous people have away. Would you have suggestions to make about how treaty feminism could be used to help us move forward? Yeah.
I think there's some of the things that I talked about in terms of supporting like queer and trans youth and Indigenous women, which would mean, I think, for example, the minimum wage going up means a big thing to probably a lot of Native single moms. I'm trying to think. Yeah, it's treaty feminism is difficult because the province is not our partner, but I think any sort of like social program that would benefit women or is going to benefit Indigenous women, it just has to go beyond those suggestions. If that makes sense.
Hello, my name is Valerie Keefe. A couple of very quick questions. First of all, you mentioned gender-confirming surgeries. I'd like to ask you what it is you think about a low-efficacy surgery that imperils trans women's sexual function, confirms their gender, other than it serving as cis-normalization. I'd also want to ask why it is you want to center gender identity when identity is coerced.
Sorry, you could repeat the first question?
Certainly.
I don't know if I can speak to it because I am a cis person, and so I'm...
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And as a cis woman who promotes a standard that structurally includes trans men their entire lives, and trans women only if and when we get out. And I was asking what it is about, again, genital reconstruction surgery is, in terms of lowering depression, lowering anxiety, far lower efficacy than hormone replacement therapy, which this government entrenched barriers to, which I've discussed in a View Weekly column August 8th. And I was asking what it is about this cis-normalizing surgery that often is used by gatekeepers as a pretext to deny HRT if patients don't seek it, you think confirms gender. And also why you want to center the concept of gender identity as opposed to neurological sex when identity is coerced, when it is avowed as a credential, when it is something that the average out trans woman doesn't access until 42, the average out trans man at 26. Can you speak to the intersection of trans misogyny and why it is perhaps you...
So for the first question, it's something that I think is really important is in my community that I've heard from people and with trans people in my life that they have that surgery. I can obviously not speak to it to the same level. It's that trans people can, but in my community, I've heard in the last weekend in a lot of group texts that that's super important. Yeah, totally. Yeah. I don't think so. I don't think that people don't have to have surgery, but for some people that want access to it, it's really important. I think that's all I can speak to for it. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, in a portion of your talk, you discussed the way that certain white activists use anti-pipeline a dialogue and asserting pro-Indigenous rights surrounding it. So I was just wondering if you're able to elaborate on what issue you have with some of it, and I guess what ways it could be better addressed than it is right now.
So, sorry, could you repeat the first part?
Because you were talking about it was basically a criticism of the approach of white activists talking about anti-pipelines and framing it in pro-Indigenous rights perspective.
So I think there's a lot of groups, I could throw Greenpeace under the bus a little bit here, that really work with Indigenous communities and I feel like gain legitimacy in working with communities and saying this is like, we're helping you, you have title to this land, we're gonna assist you in this. But when the project is done, those relationships don't continue. Or like even an example of Edmonton where we have people being anti-pipeline or doing demonstrations here. If all the communities, whether or not you honor Indian Act governance or consent in that way, have signed on to Kinder Morgan. So what does it mean when you live on someone's territory who's consented to this pipeline and you have this activism where you're saying that you're honoring First Nations rights when it's been opted in?
Hi, Emily. Just over here. I'm a social worker with Alberta Health Services, and I've worked with Alberta Health Services for about 12 years. And sorry, this isn't going to be a very intellectual question, but it's just like an observation that I have working because Indigenous people are overrepresented in the healthcare system because of the adverse impact of social determinants of health on Indigenous populations. As a social worker, I see myself supporting all patients who come through the healthcare system to access and navigate through the systems that are in place that limit their access to resources. And you mentioned NIHB as a program which is supposed to be fulfilling a responsibility to First Nations people that is very challenging to work with. And as a healthcare person, you try your best to advocate on the front line for patients. And I'm just curious to know what the Yellowhead Institute might be able to do as part of its mandate to help really hold these types of departments accountable. My experience with them is that sometimes the staff is very racist, blatantly racist in my interactions with them. They're very withholding of resources, despite us being a healthcare provider and being able to, qualify the requests for resources for basic healthcare needs. And so I'm just wondering what your organization is. I'm really excited that you formed, and I want to know what kind of accountability you can hopefully hold these partners to.
So in BC, where I live, there's the First Nations Health Authority, and they've taken on the designated service delivery of NIHB, so it's a little bit different. There's actually been no one at Yellowhead yet that's written about healthcare policy, but I think it's definitely on the radar that as a mostly First Nations organization, we understand the own challenges of accessing funding through there. And even though I often want to use NIHB first because it's my treaty right, in Treaty 6 we have the medicine chest, I end up using my private insurance just because it's easier and won't take 6 months for me to get reimbursed. So that's not on the radar, but I can bring that as someone to do a brief or a policy report on that for sure.
Hi, my name is Espen. I just wanted to speak a little bit, just a tiny bit before, because I just had a little bit of a different experience than Valerie, was it? I just want to make sure I got your name right. I didn't want to disvalue, yeah. So I'm trans male, which is a different experience altogether, and I can't speak to the experience of a trans female, but it's important to recognize that there is a spectrum on which people experience dysphoria, and sometimes it is very important for people to experience bottom surgery, but it's not necessarily necessary for a trans person to undergo in order to be recognized as the gender that they are. But I was curious because I don't know a lot about your culture, and I wanted to know about why transgender issues were important, or more about the two-spirit identity, if you could answer about that.
Yeah, for sure. So I think often two-spirit gets framed in as being about gender identity, but can be about sexuality or gender identity, which I actually have a little bit of a beef with because I feel like lots of cis Native people find their way into trans spaces through calling themselves two-spirit. But yeah, definitely in our culture there was more of a spectrum of gender which has been done away with largely through, not done away with, but a lot of violence enacted upon through the Indian Act and other means. And yeah, I guess in my paper I should have privilege, the fact that there are so many different ways that cis people can support trans people, that isn't just about surgery. This is just something definitely within policy that helps as well. Some people that choose to do that. Yeah. Thanks.
Bob asked, are there any models internationally dealing with the situation of delivering the wealth back to Indigenous peoples in terms of reparations or ceding ownership back in some? Are there any models?
No, I can't think of anything, particularly not in settler colonial countries where we're the minority. So I think that people use New Zealand as a big model of language and treaty adherence, but I don't think there's been a large transfer of property back.
Is it my turn to ask a question? I will ask a question. Hello. Thanks so much for your talk. One thing that I really appreciated that you did was like pushing the audience to question like our relationship to land and our relationship to like the settler colonial like timelines that make us think like, oh, this land belonged to this kind of person at this time, and then that invisibilizes a whole lot of other stuff. So how do you feel like those acts of challenging stories and challenging the ways we think about our time that we spend on this land, how do you feel like that can like push policy or resist either like the awful conservatives who want to do whatever they want to, and also progressives who are inherently settler colonial?
I think telling our stories about where we are and the fact that we've occupied this place for thousands of years is really important, particularly because the Doctrine of Discovery is still an active policy document in Canada, which says that anyone who's not Christian, their lands can be taken over. And this is actually how Canada proves that they have sovereignty over the land. So in the TRC recommendations, that recommends that this is repudiated, and that still hasn't happened. So I think as we continue to tell stories about how we've been here, perhaps that challenges people to move towards repudiating this doctrine too. That's sort of a direct policy thing that I can think of.
Hello, Emily. I really appreciated your presentation, and I completely understand the way treaties have been wrongly understood and applied and in practice implemented. Mm-hmm. From a practical point of view, would you have recommendations that you could give to, in quotations, the powers to be, to work towards a settlement that's fair and that goes along the initial intent of treaty? How do you see that taking form, considering Canada, again in quotation mark, as it stands today?
I suppose, I think there is a lot of work to do because our treaty is from the 1800s and we meant, I think, to come back and renegotiate it, and that hasn't happened. So we're trying to move it to 2018. It looks different. I don't think we're looking for a settlement, though. We're actually looking for it to be implemented, and that means for settlers to understand what it actually means, which means that Treaty 6 is a farming agreement. We allowed you to farm. There was no permission given for resources to be extracted by anyone else. So I guess I'm not looking for a settlement. I'm looking for implementation. And whether or not that fits in with Canada's existence is, I don't think, our problem.
Okay, sorry. I completely agree with you. And with regard, so how do you see that happening? I agree with you. I used the wrong term, settlement.
Yeah.
But for that to occur, how do you see, do you have a vision of how it could, in fact, occur?
I think when I read Hayden King, so Hayden's from an old pre-Confederation treaty in Ontario, but for him, he's saying that the first step is to give all provincial and federal crown back to First Nations, and then we can start to talk about what it looks like beyond that. So I think that would be step one in terms of treaty implementation, is to give federal and provincial crown land back. That could be the first viable thing. Other things within Treaty 6, fully fund all First Nations people to go to post-secondary, fund our schools on reserve so they're not dilapidated, provide us with healthcare that's at the same level of other Canadians or higher because we are Citizens Plus. There's as an overall model for territory for sure, but there's other things to do in the interim too.
Okay, Emily, I don't know when you sleep, but
Not a lot lately.
you might want to look at the Lubicon in northeastern Alberta. They were just recognized and compensated for not having their own land. But that had been decades before it ever got realized in the last week or two.
Yeah, that's definitely on my list. I've seen the headlines. I haven't done much reading about that. The Lubicon never adhered to Treaty 8, so they weren't even an Indian Act band for the longest time. So yeah, I have not read their self-governance situation yet. It's on my list.
I just had a quick question for you. Not really quick, but you mentioned that you've worked on Indigenous curriculum for schools and did K to 12. Could you tell us a little bit about what you've done there? I mean, what impact, how you've managed to get that curriculum into the schools?
So I work on post-secondary policy, but the organization I work for does a lot of work in developing curriculum, which means coming up with a large list of sources that teachers can use that are acceptable. There's a First Nations English class that we've developed their curriculum for. And now the big push with this increased funding is to work on curriculum for First Nations languages, because there's only about 600 students in BC in the K-12 system in a First Nations language class. So that's where we're going now. It's not something I get to work on too much, but my organization does for sure.
And where did the money come from? Just curious.
So we have a tripartite agreement with the federal government and with the provincial government that provides funding to our organization. So it's a sectoral self-governance agreement that was just renewed.
So is that it for questions then? I don't want to monopolize the. Was there one more? Okay.
Sorry, I was only going to ask it. I looked at the time that the session ends, and we still have time, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So thank you so much for that great talk. I was really interested in what you said about Hayden King's proposal about returning, or first at least starting with Crown lands. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I'm not a proponent of individual solutions, but I also know a couple settlers who are going to inherit large tracts of land that, of course, are not theirs, and the huge amount of wealth associated with that through intergenerational settlement farming. And they're interested in, as individuals, what they can do in order to return the land to Indigenous communities. And I'm wondering if Yellowhead, because one of the things I was interested in about Yellowhead is that they have focused so much on the question of, or it seems anyways, there's things on the site that talk about, the 0.2 economy and returning land. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, although again, it's not the solution, is there any thinking at Yellowhead about making a network or framework or something for individual settlers who want to engage in returning land?
Yeah, I think that it's so tricky for a number of reasons, which is, so for example, if you were to want to give your lot up in Edmonton, there's so many First Nations and the Métis who have collective title on the space as the gathering space. So I guess it would depend on where your land is, who you would give it to, which would be like a very political choice if you like chose to give your lot to Enoch here or not someone else. It's also because reserve land, in terms of doing an addition to reserve in policy, takes a really long time, has to go through the minister. So if you're actually wanting to turn private property into reserve land, that's a really long process. But I do know that there are some First Nations that hold fee simple land. So I think it would require, it depends on where it is. Edmonton's so tricky because of the shared jurisdiction. Vancouver is the same way. So depending on where your land would be, you would have to contact the First Nation. That is perhaps something to think about. For Yellowhead Institute, they're very focused, or like, I wouldn't say focused, but based in Southern Ontario where it's very developed, and there hasn't been, so I think it would be a selling point for, or I could sell that to them as a project because there's so many cottages on territory in Southern Ontario that they talk about being returned. So there's no existing framework. There's a few barriers to that, but it is something to think about.
I'm currently homeless, so if you want to sign something over.
There you go.
Yeah. Hi. My question was, you talked about the difference between Native friendship centers versus other centers, and I feel bad because I don't know anything about that. So I could just Google this later, but I'm also curious to know what the difference is between that funding and how that affects the folks that they're trying to help.
So there's always this movement to constrict the funding of reserves, and it really occurred in the mid-century era to push people off reserves in terms of not having housing, and it was definitely a civilizing effort so people would enter the labor economy. And so at the same time, there was increasing support for friendship centers, which are largely offering cultural program, but aren't First Nations bands that hold title or have any sort of political clout. So although I know Edmonton's looking for a new building for their Friendship Center, and that's really important, it's an organization versus a government. So it's as long as we have to work on having funding for urban people and working on how jurisdictional urban governance and service delivery works for people, while also not trying to slowly move funding away from First Nations governments to organizations.
Thank you for clarifying.
Well, it looks as though that may be our last question. So I, first of all, want to really thank you, Emily, for a real ride. I mean, you took us through a lot of material in a very short period of time. So thank you very, very much for giving us, if I can say this, the lay of the land, or the lay of some land. But it was a very, very interesting talk. Thank you very, very much. And would you all join me in giving... Thank you very much, and thank you very much for being here this late on a Saturday afternoon. I would just like to let you know that people are convening socially for a bit of a wee dram, as some would have it, on the 7th floor at RAT, is it? So if you want to join others there to talk about the talk, or just to schmooze with each other, you're more than welcome to do that. So thank you very much. There'll be a film shown there as well this evening later on.